Hello.
Hey Jay, did you have any topics, Jay, for today's meeting?
No specific topic, maybe just a discussion. I think you don't have so much time to look at the PR
I have not had any
about
time to
the
look into
cascading
it. Yeah,
drawdown.
I know what you're referring to. Unfortunately, not yet, but it's on my list.
And I think my next topics for me is the multi-tenant, and I think also I am working on authentication and authorization. So maybe I will take a look at the documentation, but maybe I will write some blog post to help others to configure some authentication and authorization on the Elsa controller.
You're talking about writing a blog post describing the steps. Wonderful. Yeah, that would be awesome. Very good.
The idea is to explain how you can add the authorization for all the controller, and on the UI side, how you can configure the HTTP client of the UI to send a bearer automatically for all the requests.
Okay, that's cool. Do you have a blog website somewhere that you write more blog posts regularly or once in a while? Because I was thinking maybe we should add a section on the homepage or the README of the Elsa project where we can point others to those blog posts. I think I read a blog post from you at some point, but I'm not sure. Did I lose you? Oh, you're still there. All right, so yeah, I'll just get started with Elsa 3 updates. There's some noise coming from you, it seems, Jay. Now it's gone. Thank you. Hey, Frans.
Hey, Sipke.
Let's go to the Elsa 3 updates. Personally, I've been working on the journal, but I wasn't able to make much progress because I ran into some oversight, which I will explain later. Before we get to that, let me show something cool. So here we're looking at the new designer, and the first thing you may notice if you're familiar with the new designer is there are two new buttons called Zoom to Fit and Auto Layout. And Auto Layout is not actually implemented. This was added as part of little user story to add a toolbar that's extensible, so we can add more buttons to it. But Zoom to Fit actually works. So let me show you that. So now when I click this, it zooms to fit. As you can see, there's still it needs some tweaking still because it's not taking into account this toolbar itself, and maybe some more breathing room would be nice. And also maybe we don't want to exceed the 100% zoom. So zooming out should be fine, but I don't think it makes much sense to zoom in more than 100% or maybe a little bit more, but not too much. Probably will make it configurable, but we'll see. And of course, it also works when you have a very large workflow like this, for example, and now you can zoom to fit, and now everything fits onto the canvas. But again, take into account that there's this little issue still. So this is going to be useful, especially once we have auto layout. So then when you have all sorts of connections and then you made a bit of a spaghetti workflow and you can't identify the flow anymore, you should be able to click auto layout, and then it will use probably some Dagger algorithm to lay it out in some tree structure. So yeah.
Question, Sipke.
Sure, go ahead.
I think you're gonna use max and minimum of the boxes that's for the activities. What if the connectors are extending beyond those max and minimum? Like for instance, having a connector line going over the most top one. Do you take that into account or not?
You mean for the zoom to fit algorithm?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not entirely sure I get the situation. Can you rephrase or repeat?
Yeah, if you have a connector, now this is a good example. So the maximum of the width is actually the connector itself, not the box.
Oh, I see. Good question. Let's see. Let's remove this one. So to be clear, the algorithm used is implemented by X6, which is the underlying library that we're using. So I don't know what it's using.
Okay.
But let's see what happens. Yeah, it looks like it takes into account the boxes, but not so much the connectors.
Yeah, then a bit of breathing rooms should be handling that better.
Exactly. Yeah, so some more tweaking is warranted. And I see little things like the horizontal scroll here, unnecessary. One step at a time.
Yeah, it looks great already.
Yeah, exactly. So that's all I have for Elsa 3 workflows. Elsa 3 workflow progress. As I mentioned, I ran into a little issue and I will try to explain. So as you can see here, let me actually delete this and start with an actual workflow. So let me have this one and then not this one, but for each, because this is important. And then two more of these. So now let's connect these two. And we can ignore the done for now. Let me zoom to fit. So this workflow, the way it's supposed to work is as follows. The first one, there's no context menu here. So this is the starting node. So this will execute first. And keep in mind, this is a flowchart style activity. The next activity to execute is determined by the connection, right? So we have a connection to the for each. And then, as you may recall from previous sessions, the for each activity has a body property. So the property is of type iActivity. So it's not like in Elsa 2 where then the for each has an outcome of body that then schedules the next activity. That's not how it works anymore. In Elsa 3, the for each activity itself will schedule its body activity. So in order to make that work from a model that's generated by this designer where everything is just connected nodes, I need to do a little transformation. And the transformation would be that I would basically follow the next connection from the designer. And then whatever node is connected, I will take that node and add it as a property on the for each. So the for each would have a body property. And then I assign that property the value of the right line activity in this example. And I call it transposition. And it works, except for the fact that I didn't take into account the next one. So here, whenever the for each activity would execute, it would successfully schedule the right line activity, which would then execute. And then, because this one is now finished, the for each activity would complete. And because it would complete, the outer flowchart would execute or schedule its next child. What it would do is it would see, oh, okay, I have no more activities connected, because it would not see this one, because this one is connected to that one, and because this one is completed and there's no other activity, well, I could of course this one here to done. So if we would execute this workflow, after for each executed, it would have executed this one and then finally this one, but this one would be skipped. So that was an omission on my end, which I'm fixing. And the way to fix it is by looking ahead a little bit, because the body property is only accepts a single activity. So I cannot put two activities into it. So I could not add this one as a list into the body. So instead, what needs to happen is this body activity itself needs to be a container. So first I create a container, and to that container I then add these activities. And then whatever that container may be would then handle the scheduling of these two activities. And because the nature of this designer, which is flowchart without containment, the default container should be a flowchart. We can add a little bit more logic later on that can be more intelligent and try and add a sequence, for example. So in this case, this could be wrapped by sequence, and then that sequence would be assigned to the body property, which would make sense. This is how you would do it when you use the C# syntax to define workflows. But from the designer point of view, it's a different paradigm. Go ahead, Jay.
Yes, that's exactly how I see the thing. I think we already discussed on this. We could modify the designer to embed all the activities of the sequence, maybe directly in the for each component. Yes, I think we already discussed on this, but it's exactly how I see the thing, to move all the activity in a sequence, in a container, and after could allow us to embed sequence in the UI component of the for each.
That's exactly right.
We can collapse it.
Yes.
And on user experience perspective, it will be the best thing.
I agree. So that would be one of the next goals, to create a different kind of designer that does exactly what you just described, Jay, where we can contain nodes. So we would have a sequential diagram, sequence designer, and that looks very similar to Windows Workflow Foundation. We would have a flowchart, a different type of flowchart activity, where you can still have this flowchart style, but each node in the flowchart would itself be a container. So you would expand it and then either add a sequence or an individual activity or another flowchart or a state machine, whatever. Then it would be a more natural fit to the programming model or the workflow structure of Elsa 3. Because here we are basically mapping a different structure onto the Elsa 3 structure. And that would prevent us from having to do what I'm doing right now. The reason I am doing this is because this kind of designer is easier to implement and it's more similar to Elsa 2. So those two things, I think, make it easier for me to at some point release an initial version, which will work well, and then we can evolve it over time with different kinds of activities in there. Designers. One thing I was wondering about is what would be the name if we want to keep this activity, which is currently called flowchart, and we want to introduce another kind of flowchart that is very similar to the Windows Workflow Foundation flowchart. We can't use the same names, but if anyone has any suggestions for a name, or maybe we could configure the flowchart activity itself to use one designer or the other. It could be, in other words, it could be a configuration, but this is still outstanding for me at least.
I don't have a name for it. I will think about it. But going through the whole tree is kind of challenging, I guess, because there could be an for each in that one and an if. And when do you see that it's ending and which elements? Because you can have multiple splits basically in the child element after the for each. You have to take that all into account.
Exactly. That's the challenge. So, for example, we could have another for each here, and of course a switch, which is a whole different thing. I didn't work, so that's broken right now. But a switch has its own set of rules to provide more connections to child activities. So the way I'm going about that is, of course, there's recursing into it. So what I'm basically doing, I'm taking all of the connections, starting with the root. So the flowchart has this notion of the first or the starting node, and using that as a root, I take all of its connections. So in here, there's this one connection, and then at the other end of this connection, there's this target. So this is the source node, this is the target node. I then look at its connections. So here there's two outgoing connections. In the first outgoing connection, this one has a target of write line, but for each connection, I also look at the source port. So body is a port, done is a port, and I look at the name of this port. And if the port name matches an outbound property on the activity, then I transpose the target of this connection into that property. And this is what I do recursively. So that way this will work, because from this point on, because I noticed that there's this outbound property, this outbound activity property, I should say, I know that I will now create a subflow or a container. For now, I'm using a subflow. As I mentioned, it could be a container, could be something else to be determined, but by default, I will use a subflow. And then I basically get all descendant connections. So right now there's just two descendants, and this is the current connection, so two descendants. I basically cut the rest of the tree and then paste it into the subflow, and then I repeat that process into the subflow, and then at some point I will get into this portion here and do the same steps. So it's a little bit tricky. It works. It would have been simpler if the designer matches the structure of the underlying model, of course.
Do you take into account for an infinite loop, last for each could reroute back to the first write line, or as an input for the other for each, I guess?
Yeah, you could do things like this.
Then recursively, you're going to be having an infinite loop here.
Yeah, exactly. These things need to be taken into account. Right now, it's not even finished, so let alone infinite looping is not handled. But we will have to handle those scenarios.
Yeah.
I don't even think this should be allowed. And the nice thing about containment is that this would not even be possible. But with this free flow editor, you can basically do anything, unless we build in these guards, right? We could determine that, oh wait, this is now part of a lower level part of the hierarchy, so this should not be possible. But yeah, we need to.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So normally there is a cyclic graph detection, which basically says that a child node should not have a linear path to the parent. So there are some algorithms for detecting cyclic graphs. I think it could help to prevent this, because if we don't prevent that, your algorithm itself to find the child activities, it will go into an infinite loop.
What did you call this?
Cyclic graph.
Graph prevention detection.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's a great remark. I will look into that. And it makes sense. A child should not loop back into one of its parents like this.
Is that the case? Because if you have a schedule that I saw some samples in Elsa 2 where you could say, well, if you're, I think in the documentation approval thingy, where you could wait with a split and a join, that you have to wait and it sends a remark every one day to remind you to approve or not, and then you go back. I don't know if that is going to be the same structure here. Yeah, you can see that it's going to go up again.
So Elsa 2 is interesting. On the one hand, everything is of a single hierarchy. There's no hierarchy, but then at the same time it tries to model some hierarchies artificially. So by default, everything is flat. So this is a flowchart. These activities, none of them are parents of others. They are just connected in this connectome, if you will. But then there's activities like for each or if. And then, well, let's take the for each as an example. The for each, it's not shown here, but the for each has an iterate outcome, and then whenever the iterate branch has completely finished, the for each activity itself is scheduled again, and basically trying to mimic a parent-child relationship between the parent for each and the child iterate activities. But that's not how it's modeled structurally, but functionally it tries to achieve that behavior. Compare that to Elsa 3. In Elsa 3, there is actually an hierarchical structure, and there we are using the same flowchart editor. This is more designed. This is intended to be used on a level structure, not an hierarchical structure. So there's a mismatch there. So in Elsa 2, it should work. It's fine, except for the fact that the activities like for each try to mimic an hierarchy, which it shouldn't. So I think to fix this mismatch in Elsa 2, we should remove the parent-child attempt, but we can't do it because we will break everyone. In Elsa 3, the structure is already hierarchical in nature, but we should fix the designer by supporting containment. And even if we have a flowchart designer, within that particular flowchart, the nodes within it will be on the same level. There will not be parent-child nodes in that regard. You can have, like in a Windows Workflow Foundation, you can add a node, and then you can add activities to that node, but those activities will be contained by said node. And then there's different kinds of nodes. There's a container node, there is a switch node, I believe, but those are specifically crafted for the flowchart model.
Yeah, as long as it is contained and that in the container itself it's not like a hierarchy, then it's going to work. And then you should prevent it indeed to have it relate back to a parent node. That it would work. But otherwise I couldn't see how it would work if you have a reminder that is rescheduled after a day over and over again, because then it feels like you have to go back to your parent, but it's apparently on the same node then.
Exactly. If it's a true flowchart, then the reminder and whatever activity you want to do in response to the timer event, they are at the same level, and you would just connect back to the previous node, because in a flowchart that's valid. In this flowchart, this is actually this one is a child of for each, but it's displayed as the same level, and that's where the issue lies. But in reality, this is a child of this one. So here, this could never be a send email activity, for example, while this is a timer, where this is a child of the timer. That shouldn't work. But what should work is just having a timer node, which then is, once it triggers, it's done, and then the next activity gets scheduled through this connection, and that should work fine. But not when this is a container, and that's the confusing part in this designer, because there's no way of telling, oh, body is a child, or this is a child of for each. You don't see it visually. So yeah, moving right along. What else? So that was a bit of transposition and that issue, and this is interesting. Jay, did you want to talk about the multi-tenancy topic?
Yes, just it's one topic I think we need to work, because I think there is some missing high tenant configuration for different controller. For example, if you save your workflow today, there is no information about the tenant. Maybe I have missing some things. There is just on a get, on maybe on list, but not for all the controller. And I think there is something to do on this. And maybe, as I wrote on the Discord, maybe we have to write some elements and discuss on what we want to do with multi-tenancy. Be sure that we want to, for example, split a database with the high tenant element, or split to a multiple database, etc., etc. Maybe we need to specify different scenario for this. This is for multi-tenancy, and what you showed on Discord was more about the persistence issue with composite activity.
So this issue is unrelated to multi-tenancy?
Yes, this is another topic, but this is about the persistence of property when you use composite activity, and it's also an interesting topic, because if you load or use large data and you use a composite activity, there is no way to override the configuration and to be sure that you use transient to not store the data for example, on the database, and this has a limit, very limiting the performance of the flow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem with these today with composite activities. This is not honored, so it will store everything as part of the workflow, and that can be problematic for, as you say, when using large data or non-serializable objects.
Yes, and I think there is a two level. There is a content property here, and for example, I map the content property for the message property in the build method. And as you see, I have tried to force the transient for the message property. I think I succeed to do this. It is understood by the engine, but the content property is not stored as transient. It is always stored.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we need to fix that. Did you raise an issue for this by any chance that we can look into for 2.9 maybe?
Sure, I will write an issue.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, that's good. So back to the multi-tenancy topic. Such a interesting but also complex topic because there's, as you say, Jay, there's few levels at which you can make this, cut. There's multi-tenancy at the database level or at the record level, actually. So where you use a discriminator on the record level using a column called tenant ID, for example. So that's implementation in Elsa was started, but it's not complete and it hasn't been completed. It's been worked on occasion by people who use it in specific scenarios, but it's not ideal because if you think it's there and you start to use it, and then you'll keep running into scenarios where multi-tenancy isn't fully completed, and this is a bit of an issue. So that's record level multi-tenancy, and then there's of course multi-tenancy at the service container level, if you will. And at that level, you can configure different database connections if you want. And this way you can use the same database server, but use different databases per tenant. Depending on the database provider, you could even have the same database, but use a prefix per tenant so that you use the same database. But each set of tables are using their own prefix or maybe even their own schema if the database provider supports that. We don't have such a provider today, except maybe for YesSQL. I think YesSQL might allow you to prefix your set of database tables per tenant. But none of this is implemented today. There is a pull request that adds this functionality. And this is a different kind of multi-tenancy. So this is not record level multi-tenancy, but it's configuration multi-tenancy, basically, where you can use configuration to specify your tenants. So here's a default one, but you could add more tenants to this configuration. The main reason this hasn't been merged yet is because of the implementation. This implementation requires certain modules of Elsa to be aware of the multi-tenancy. And I am not sure, but I think it should be possible to implement container level multi-tenancy unobtrusively, sort of without any Elsa services having to be aware of the fact that they are part of a tenant. I know that Orchard Core has implemented it. I know Artifact has support for multi-tenant service containers. So I discussed this with this contributor, and he's doing a bit of a proof of concept to see what's possible there. So this is for Elsa too.
And I think just about multi-tenancy, there is a question about the database where you store a lot of information, but there is also a question about the storage of the event. For example, if you use the service bus, maybe you want to use multi-tenancy also for the trigger, etc., etc. It's more large than just saving data in the database.
Yeah, good point. So since this is configuration based, you could use a different connection string for different service bus so that your tenant is isolated in that way by using a different service bus altogether. But if you use the same database table, the same configuration, but have multi-tenancy at the record level, then maybe you also want that for the messaging stories, where a message belongs to a given tenant and is then routed to the correct consumer of the tenant. So this requires some proper design sessions and some prototyping, which we may want to do for Elsa 2. For Elsa 3, there's nothing in terms of multi-tenancy, but the same architecture would apply there. All right, so the issue you mentioned is Composite activity source provider. All right, these are the topics I had in mind. If anyone has any topic at this point, let me know. And otherwise, we can end the session for today. All right, thanks everyone for joining and participating, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you. Bye.